What's going on, guys? Zedd here, bringing you another Marvel Midnight Suns video. This one is one that's sort of a response to people's questions about, I get them on stream all the time or YouTube, like, oh, what decks should I run? What do you recommend? Who should I use? Like, who to play and what to build on them. And while I have my own opinions of what's good or what's bad, I think it's important to empower players to do what they want, right? And I think it's cool to come up with ideas of your own, and I'll just kind of give you a little push. But what I found was people were still kind of not clicking with the ideas of like what's good or bad. And I also wanted to make this video because I get a lot of people asking me like, oh, what do you think of this card? What do you think of that card? Why don't you use this? Why don't you use that? And lastly, I think that one of the reasons why people maybe struggle with breaking out of Heroic and into Ultimate is partially because they might be using some of these cards at one or two copies, and I don't think this is a major factor by any means, as like I've used some of these cards, but you have to be very deliberate, very purposeful. You have to know why and when to use these cards, and some of them you just should never touch. So in this video we're going to discuss what the worst cards in the game are for each character. Now, the way I've structured it, this will be a link down below if you want to reference it. It'll also be on my anthology, of course. And the way this is going to work is I'm just going to go down the roster, starting with Hunter and ending with Wolverine, and we're just going to talk about the worst three, and there's going to be an honorable mention fourth. It's that the fourth card isn't necessarily bad, and I mean, they may even be used, but like there's a glaring issue with the card that makes it almost make the list, but not quite. Now, obviously, this is not a tier list, that's a different video, but this is a list that's discussing power levels. But at the same time, I encourage you to look at this with an open mind if you're maybe struggling to get to the hard difficulties and that's your goal, or you're maybe like, man, this card just like it's just not clicking. Hopefully we can maybe hash it out in this video. And yeah, let's just, I guess, get right into it. It'll make sense once I get started. So first up, Hunter. These are the three cards: Morningstar, Dark Blessing, Deadly Ground. I'll talk about each in brief detail, and our honorable mention is Summon Charlie. So first up, Morningstar. Frankly, like, Morningstar just takes too long to really get going, and the fact that it takes, I believe the math is 6 uses to get to the max damage is just like absurd to me. It kind of requires you to run 2 copies, or it also requires what's it called? Holy Gift, right? Holy Gift, so you can keep it in your hand, things like that, right? So it just doesn't work. Even when you take all the light cards and all the colors that support Morningstar's playstyle, it's just not worth it. Not to mention, it takes 2 deck slots and 2 attack slots away from other far more powerful Hunter attack skills. And to top it off, I have just as a bullet point here, I don't know why this card's an epic rarity. Like, it's just awful. This card's dreadful. I don't know why you would want to use this, but I've tried it. It's kind of fun. The animation's cool, but no, it's not good. Dark Blessing, I feel like this one most people figured out is pretty bad on their own. I'm pretty sure nobody uses this, but like the long and short of it is it becomes useless by the time you get at least a few upgrades in your decks, or a few upgrades in your decks. And so pretty much outside of Act 1, it should be seeing 0 play. And to top it off, I don't know why, but it does self-harm. Like, I don't know what that's about, but Dark Blessing is just horrendous. And then next up, Deadly Ground. Deadly Ground, I hate this card. If you saw me attempt to use this card, I attempted like a Deadly Ground build run, but it was just so gut-wrenching and just awful, and it was just tilting, and so while doable, it just felt horrible. And the reason why is the summon 1 light, 1 dark, you can't control where those go. It's just straight RNG, and I am convinced that they've designed it to spawn away from the enemies, because the sheer number of times that it would be in completely unusable locations is astronomical. Like, I'm not exaggerating. And it's just, it bothers me that it's the same damage as an explosive, it's the same AoE as an explosive. You have to interact with it via heroism or knockback to explode. Like, to me, it's such an underdeveloped, under-designed card. I really hope it sort of inspires other card designs and like trap-based mechanics on maybe future DLCs like Deadpool or Storm. Because Deadly Ground is a card that should theoretically fit my playstyle, and I hate it. Like, this card is awful. It is so useless, so bad, and it costs a card play, for goodness sake. Like, at least if this card was free, I wouldn't have it on this list, because at the very least, it'd be like, okay, you're kind of into the whole environmental attack thing. It's a pretty good card for you. And at free, you're not subtracting from like the rest of your game plan, right? This card needs free. But as a baseline, like, I don't know who designed this, but they need to be fired. And yeah, like, if it was more akin to Crossbones Mines, where it was a time-based explosion, even that would be far better, because then you could get an AoE stun or like an AoE vulnerability. And that's the other thing, is when you do knock somebody into it, it's not an AoE stun or an AoE vulnerability, it's just that target. So Deadly Ground is horrible. If you've never used it, you should continue to not use it. If you want to see just how bad it is, I encourage you to try. But please, no. Next up is Blade. So Blade... so Hunter was kind of easy because they have 30 cards, right? But now we're getting into the rest of the cast where they only have 10 cards. And so some of these, you'll be like, what? Why is that on the list? Keep in mind they only have 10. And my goal was to do bottom 3 plus 1, right? So I'll do my best to explain why that is. So, first up, Strike. Strike falls off pretty hard after you pull Epics. Always feels bad to play for any reason other than Bleed Spread, which is outclassed by Daywalker, which is the Epic in question. So, basically what this is saying is, Daywalker is just a better Strike. Now, before you're like, oh, but one costs heroism, it's like, well, who cares? Who cares? Because as you'll find, we're not using Stake, where you often don't really want to use Glaive. So Daywalker at 2 copies is pretty much the only heroic card that Blade should be running in at the higher difficulties. Now, like, you may flex a Stake or you might flex Glaive here and there, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but the reality is it doesn't matter. Like, you can cut Strike, and there are so many other attack cards that you'd rather run, like Reaper, Quick Strike, and it's not good, frankly. So Strike, it just falls off, and like the damage is awful. It's only used to spread bleed, so you might as well use Daywalker that has an additional chain and does slightly more damage and spreads the bleed, right? So Strike is just an outclass card. It's not bad. Obviously you need it, and you do run it at first, but as soon as you start pulling some Daywalkers, you should try to transition out of Strike. Next up, Relentless. Relentless is a single target DPS ability that doesn't even hit hard in the grand scheme of things. Super underwhelming, replaced with Reaper. So what I'm saying here is basically, if you want to burst damage with Blade, you need to transition away from Strike Relentless into Reaper Daywalker, because popping those bleeds is going to be far more valuable than using Relentless. On top of that, Relentless does have a condition, so it has to be the second action that enemy takes rather than the first. And overall, it just doesn't feel great. Like, it's good if you can get one in the early game. There are times where I've got, like, on my last run, I got Relentless Plus it, like, really early into Act 1, so that was nice. That was a nice little power spike, but you definitely want to transition out of it. It's not that great. And then next up is Stake. Stake is inherently a well-designed card. I like what it's going for. I like what it's trying to do. But the reality is, you're going to get to a point in the game where you don't need this lifesteal on Blade. And when that time comes, it just becomes a 2 heroism deal damage card. And that's not very good, at least for Blade and what his game plan is. It's just not... yeah, it's just not that great. You might as well run Relentless at that point, right? Like, if we took Lifesteal off of Stake and we looked at these cards side by side, and note that these screenshots were taken from the same account at the same time, so the damage is comparable, we can see that Relentless is actually doing more damage than Stake under certain situations. So Stake, quite simply falls off once you don't need that lifesteal. But early on, it's nice to have, or if you're not running a hunter on side missions early on, like I often don't, it's nice to have, but eventually you can transition out of it. And then the honorable mention, oh, I forgot to mention the honorable mention with Hunter. It's Summon Charlie, but at least Charlie has Howl and a health pool to take a hit. That's it. Um, honorable mention is Savage for Blade, but at the very least, while Savage is expensive and like it's a more expensive Relentless, it does far more damage than Relentless, specifically against protectors and shield guards. So it's not that unreasonable to say that, let's say you're doing a capture agent mission or destroy device mission, and you're a really big Blade fan, right? You just like the character, and I respect that. Or maybe it's a destroy device mission and you have like revenants, right? And I've done some of those. If you get into those missions, Savage is amazing because instead of needing like a bind, right? So Doctor Strange, Spider-Man, or banish from Magik, like you don't need that hard CC. You can just go the route of just killing the unit, right? So Savage does have some niche application, but the reality is you'd have to have it in the deck for protectors and shield guards and know that there's going to be a protector and shield guard. Now, could you load in the mission, see what's there, and get out and change your deck, go back in? Yeah, you could, but like, what are we doing here at that point, right? What are we doing here? So, Savage is an honorable mention, but at least it doesn't get outclassed, it does have a niche application, and it does do more damage than all three of these cards, which is why it's not in the top three, or bottom three, I should say. Captain Merca. So Merca, you're going to see a trend here with his list, so we're going to kind of keep it short. Shield Bash is just clunky and hard to use because it requires the best defense, which is one of Cap's best cards. And even with the best defense, it does pretty like ho-hum damage at best. Not to mention that getting a high block anyway on higher difficulties can be quite challenging. Now, if you're in a situation where your turn is something in the realm of like dig in, best defense, shield bash, sure, but like you're really putting all your eggs in Cap's basket, excuse me, and you're really just like that's not a good turn. Like just to put it bluntly, that is such a garbage turn. It's just not good. Shield bash, it just doesn't work. It's not great. Yeah. Spang. Spang is quite simply just a single target damage skill that feels pretty rough to draw and use. I don't know about you, but when I'm playing Cap, I'm not like, you know what I could really use here? Spang. Like, whereas you do feel that way about like Dig In, the best defense, Tactician, Quick Punch, like Shield Bounce. Those are the cards you want, not Spang. And so Spang is just awkward. It's nice, I guess, if you want to go like Cap carry, like if you had a run and you're like, I love Captain America, I want him in all my team comps. You might want to run Spang, I guess, if you're, let's say you're doing a mission where the side mission requires a tank, like say it's a Wolverine mission. Maybe. But the reality is, it feels awful to use. It doesn't change his game plan. It doesn't add to it, and it just has to contest in a deck slot with shield bounce, with the likes of shield bounce, and that's a tough battle to win for Cap's other heroics. Which leads me to my next point: shield charge. Pretty much everything I said about shield bash is exactly true. But furthermore, it's expensive at 4 heroism, and it requires enemies to be aligned in a line. So yes, it works with the best defense. I've tried this. I thought it was pretty good. But I can't tell you the amount of times that I was just seeing shield charge, redraw, redraw, redraw. And it got to a point where I had it in the deck, but I was never actually playing it. So pardon me, it got to a point where I'm like, this card is not that good. And again, it's contesting with other much more useful cards. So shield charge is up there. Now the honorable mention, punch. So punch is a card that it's not bad on paper, but when you use it, it's like, like when you buff it, it gets just more damage. But I would much rather it be forceful knockback taunt. That would be far more useful, and then it would make Brooklyn Handshake pretty bad. But because punch is the way it is and Brooklyn Handshake is the way it is, punch is not that great to me. However, it can be nice for control because if you knock back someone into like a like a gunship AoE, like on Crossroads mission when you punch Rumlow into his AoEs, punch can be good in those situations, or like as a point and click taunt, it can be good without consuming your quick punch. So it definitely has some application, but for me, when I'm using punch, it just feels bad. Like when I see punch drawn, I'm like, oh, but I'll use it, like it, I guess so kind of card. So that's Captain America. Captain Marvel. So this one's probably going to be a little divisive, actually. But my first one here is Cosmic Ray. The reality is, I have tried to make this card work a few times, and it just feels awful. Once again, like, think about this for a second. These cards were taken from the same screenshot, or same time frame in the game. So you look at Cosmic Ray, it's base 40 plus 60, Photon Beam 100, and then Rain of Blows at 1 heroism is 66 damage. So even if we just look at these three cards, not that they're necessarily comparable, but Cosmic Ray's damage is pretty mediocre. And the argument with Marvel when you're discussing her cards and damage output is always, well, but Zedd, she needs binary. And it's like, well, okay, that's true, but why are we using Cosmic Ray then? Cosmic Ray does not lend itself to being used in that way. It doesn't benefit that game plan. It's not helpful. It's vying for spots with the likes of like Quick Jab or Knee Strike. Knee Strike, while also underwhelming, it at least gives block, and Quick Jab is a good way to generate binary in stacks in the first place. So the other thing with Cosmic Ray is the on KO gain 1 counter. Her passive already does this at 20%. So you might be overstacking, and yes, they do stack. However, it's just not worth it. Especially, you should be running 2 copies of Bring It On, which is also a counter. So, like, in general, Cosmic Ray is just a very unnecessary card. The animation's kind of neat, but that's it. Like, that's all it has going for it. Photon Beam, I actually hate this card with a passion. I think it's awful. I think it's poorly designed. If it did, like, I believe this card does 100% offense. If it was 150% offense and no taunt, oh man, this would be way better. It would be way better. But no, it taunts and damages enemies in a line. So you only want to use it as a finisher or as a minion cleanup tool. And for 3 heroism, that's very expensive. Because it's quite difficult. Pardon me, it's quite difficult to maintain binary when you're taunting everybody into your face, right? And that's honestly just the long short of it. The damage scales really poorly without binary too. And yeah, drawing aggro to Carol is not what you want. Rain of Blows, same thing as Photon Beam. It's counterintuitive to maintaining binary as it consumes all block, which of course consumes binary. If this card red consumes all block but 1, or consumes 99% of block, that would be so good. Like that would make this card from useless to a staple, and it would be awesome. It would be good. It would feel great. But no, it's all. So this card is only used as a finisher, and even then, as I've written here, it requires approximately 7 heroism minimum to be worth the damage output non-binary, or outside of binary. If you're looking at like heroism to damage output, etc., which is a different conversation, but just about 6-7 heroism to be worth it. And then in binary, it would take about 4 to be worth it. It doesn't quite half it, yeah. So plus the fact that you would need to generate the heroism and get rid of your binary and run this card in the deck in the first place. It's just too many things for Rain of Blows to work. Next is Doctor Strange. Honestly, he doesn't even really need to be on this list, but I do think he has a couple of bad cards. And the honorable mention will probably be divisive, as will the Astral Meditation, but I am me, and this is my content, so I'm going to give you my opinion. So first up is Bolt of Belthok. It is not technically a bad card. The issue is you would have to run it in the deck. Now, what I mean by that is it's a relatively high damage ability that requires, or of course has the enhanced, right? And so it would take 6 heroism to do optimal damage. But the issue is it's contesting with the likes of Winds of Watum, or it's taking away an Agamotto's Gaze, or it's taking away, a Vapors of Valtor, things like that, right? So Bolt of Balthok just doesn't fit into Strange's thing. Now, in my Strange decks, I do often run a 7 Sons of Cinnabis, his legendary card. I will say that if I wasn't running that, I would probably run a Bolt of Balthok. And the reason why is Strange is very good at generating and keeping heroism. Axe of Angarimus is nice, but it consumes it. And that's his highest damaging skill. Whereas Bolt of Balthok, if you ran one copy and you had it in this moment where it's like, I need a nuke, but I really would like to keep this heroism, it can see some niche use there. But the reality is I do run 7 Sons of Cinnabis, so therefore Bolt of Balthok is useless. And even if you didn't run 7 Sons, I think there's an argument to still not run Bolt. So the reality is I think you should only run 2 Winds of Watum as your only strange attack cards, and that's just why this is on the list. Blessing of the Vishanti, this card is what I consider, and the first time I saw this card, the first time I used it, even before the game came out, I was like, that card sucks. That's a do nothing card. And if you've ever seen my stuff or watched my streams, you'll hear me talk about do nothing cards all the time. And Blessing of the Vishanti always comes up in that conversation because the reality is it only affects cards in your hand, and if you wanted to really get meat and potato value out of this, you'd have to run and have things in your hand, such as Crack the Sky, Midnight Special, Eviscerate, Daywalker, Witchfire, Witch's Storm, right? Like, you'd have to have these chain cards or multi-hitting cards in hand already, then play Vishanti, which is already in your deck, then it buffs it. And not only that, it has to be in your hand, right? Like, that's the issue. If Vishanti Red give all hero cards in your deck, right, more damage, I still wouldn't think it's that good, but it at least would be like, if that's your whole shtick, if you're running like a chain composition or a chain composition, then at least I can get behind that. What I can't get behind is this. I don't like this. I hate this card. I think it's awful. I think it's just always the worst thing to draw. It feels terrible. Yeah, I hate this card. I think it's awful. And it's just too inconsistent to make use of. Astral Meditation, next up, is by definition a do-nothing card, quite literally, as combat items are not that good or necessary in the first place. Now, this is not me flexing. This isn't me going, you use combat items, you suck. Quite the opposite. I think that combat items suck, and you're just trying to have fun with the game, and I respect you for that. But the amount of players I've seen across all difficulties in the Discord, in my chats and stuff, that say, I don't even use combat items. It's too much work to build them running around the Abbey grounds. It's too much work to like research them. It's too much work to find them from chests. It's too much work to even like remember to use them. Like, they're not integrated very well into the game, and they're not even that good to begin with. And some of them are good, but they're just win harder buttons. They're not like, oh my god, I need this or I lose. Like I've literally never had that happen. And so while some players may need them and use them, that's totally your prerogative. Now, let's talk about Astral Meditation. Is it worth restoring those items and filling your deck slot with a card that does that? I don't think so. Like, when I remember I drew this comparison the other day to someone. I said, we were talking about Astral Meditation. He said it was good. I said it was bad. And I said, would you run a card that was gain 3 friendship with this hero, Exhaust? And he's like, no, that's silly. I'm like, okay. So you like if this read gain, like, just pulling Astral Meditation, gain 3 friendship with Doctor Strange, plus 2 redraw as Exhaust, you would not run that card unless you were being silly and it was like your first playthrough and you were like, oh, I just need to power farm him to 5. Then whatever, right? Like, just as a temporary progressional thing, but you would not choose to run that in the deck once he was max friendship, right? So Astral Meditation is awful because it doesn't do anything. Now, restoring 2 combat items that were a pain in the ass to make, they probably weren't worth making in the first place. So, from a strategy power perspective, Astral Meditation is one of the worst cards in the game. Probably like bottom 3, which is funny because it's on one of the top 3 characters. But if you use combat items, I actually might encourage you to use this card because I think those things are way too difficult to use or craft and they're not worth your time. So anyway, that's my thoughts on Astral Meditation. You can be salty all you want about it. Oh, honorable mention, Shield of the Seraphim. This one's a weird one because resist is not a bad effect. Quite the opposite. Resist is a very good effect. However, I have just found that Shield of the Seraphim at base 3 cost and enhanced 6 cost, I believe, 5 or 6. It's far too expensive for its effect, in my opinion. It's just not there. And the fact that resist doesn't work against supervillains, it means it's not that point and click use. It's not, oh, Shield of the Seraphim play. Like, no, it's only useful sometimes. It doesn't work against all enemy types. It doesn't work against the ones that you would want to resist the most. So Shield of the Seraphim, it's just big, it's expensive, it's clunky, but it's not a bad card. It's just a bit too niche for my taste. All right, Ghost Rider. Ghost Rider Immolate. So this card is just dreadful. It's so bad. It harms your team more than helps it because this explosion does do damage to your team and him. And it's not even a do nothing card as I've written. It's more like a negative card. Like it's an actively handicapping yourself card. Like this card's awful, and the explosive damage that it does is just awful. It basically just it does less damage than an explosive barrel at the time of taking this screenshot, which is just sad. I remember because I checked. I was like, does this? Yeah. So I don't. Immolate is just very underwhelming, underpowered. If it read does not damage enemies or allies, and it did like the same as an explosive barrel, then okay, maybe we're getting somewhere, right? But no, in its current form, Immolate's just not good. Hill's Fury. The gist of it is it's too hard to get stacked up, and most importantly, it's completely contradicted or counteracted rather by one of Ghost Rider's best cards, that being Hellride, right? Because Hellride discards your whole hand, and once Hell's Fury is discarded, it doesn't maintain the buff. It's gone. And so while Hell's Fury in theory is kind of like Morningstar, except a bit easier to use and you don't need to run 2 copies. The reality is you're not going to get this off. And yeah, it just doesn't work. And then Hellride dumps it, or Retribution, if you run that, could dump it. Things like that, right? So Hell's Fury, it's just clunky. You never actually use it. The card itself in a vacuum is not that bad, but if you compare it, or if you think of it in terms of Ghost Rider's kit, it just doesn't work. And then last up, Judgment. Judgment I find just incredibly underpowered, frankly. Like, there's really not much to say. I don't think the damage is high enough because it's only consuming 25%. This is the kind of card that it would only be good if you've stacked your Ghost Rider passive twice, and even then, it wouldn't be that good. So this card gets better the longer the mission takes, but the reality is missions should be taking you, like, just regular side mission, no villain reinforcement, about 3 to 5 turns. So let's say 4 on average. And then story missions are what? 8 to 12 if you're getting kind of slow. So let's say 10. And if the Ghost Rider passive isn't bugged, you've only filled it twice. And so it caps pretty quick, and even at cap, it's not that great. And so yes, it's an AoE, which is kind of cool. But Judgment just doesn't do enough for my taste, especially when compared to the likes of Hellride or Lash in terms of damage output. So yeah, Judgment's not great. And then honorable mention, Drain Soul. Now this one I wanted to explain briefly. I actually don't hate Drain Soul anymore. I used to hate it, but then I stopped running it in my Ghost Rider decks, and I only used the ones he gained from his passive. Now what I found was that his passive version of Drain Soul is actually pretty decent. Reason why is it doesn't take a spot in the deck originally, and then when you get it, it's like, okay, yeah, I could use this to top up the boy, or take out minions next turn, or take out totems if it's Nest Mother, and then after that, you could always just use it to like heal. Once it gets to 2, 3, 4 heroism, it's actually a pretty substantial heal. So, and frankly, there's nothing you can do about the passive drain soul. If I could choose to turn that off, I would. Um, and because of that notion, because of the fact that I just said, if I could turn off the free drain soul, I would. That is why it's the honorable mention. So it's not the drain soul hard necessarily so much as it is the passive and the way it works. It's just clunky to get. It's like, I don't want this in the deck. I don't want to redraw this and draw it later. Um, it's just clunky and I hate it, so that's why it's here. Hulk. Hulk is a fairly, like his cards are fairly cut and dry, fairly basic. They don't have a lot of nuance to them. And so making this list was actually a bit tricky. But let's do it. So first up, Crush. Crush, the issue is the target needs to be stunned in order to do more damage. I feel like this doesn't really need a lot of explanation. Combo cards in general are just too difficult to pull off. They're not that great. And yes, he does have 2 stuns in his kit via Thunderclap and Smash, but the reality is to run Crush would take away from something else that is non-conditional and non-situational. So not great. And the upgraded effect doesn't change the damage or anything. It just makes it not consume rage. And that is not significant enough for me. That's not a good enough upgrade to be good. So not much to say on Crush. I think it's incredibly awful and underwhelming and just why are you bothering? Next up, Gamma Kick. Gamma Kick as a forceful knockback taunt, apply weak. These 3 effects are really nice actually, like quite nice. But there are 2 issues with this card, 3 issues with this card. First up, it has no damage coefficient. And if you're playing Hulk with his rage mechanic and you're using no damage coefficient attacks, it's like, what are we doing here, right? Like, why are we here? So Gamma Kick just feels horrible because at any rage stage, yeah, like, yes, it does more damage because knockback is based off your offense, but not having that base damage on top of forceful knockback makes it feel really, really bad. And when Hulk attacks something, it should be dead. So weak should not be a factor, okay? That's why I don't like Gamma Kick. And then the third thing is that it takes 1 rage. Like, the fact that everything he does costs him rage, other than, like, Crush's benefit or Smash, is so frustrating when you look at cards like Gamma Kick. You're like, why does this cost me a rage? This should not cost a rage. So yeah, I think Gamma Kick is just weird. Like, it's not a bad card on its own. If you look at it and you're like, okay, you don't know what character it is, you're like, okay, that's actually a pretty good card. Then you factor in how Rage works and how Hulk functions, and you're like, well, that doesn't really make sense. Always Angry. This is a card that I've actually like flip-flopped on this card a lot. And I used to think it was good, and then I thought it was bad. And then I was like, at 1 copy it's good. And now I'm like, maybe 1 copy until you don't need it anymore. And that's kind of where I'm at. The card is nice early on in the game, on like New Game Plus, when maybe you have less taunt control, or maybe you don't have as much like healing output. Maybe you're not running a Hunter, right? Your Nico doesn't have Restore yet. Things like this, right? So it's good to have early on, I think, but you want to try to get away from it. It does have Exhaust, and that is its saving grace, and that's why running, I think, 1 copy of Always Angry. I mean, I kind of do it sometimes. 1 copy of Always Angry is fine. If you're like, no, I do want to have the option to self-heal with this, fine, right? That's fine. But I think you should try to get away from it. Then honorable mention, Thunderclap. This one's probably a hot take. Let me explain why. So I put Thunderclap on this list as my honorable mention simply for the fact that I cannot count to you how many times I redraw Thunderclap. Like, anytime, almost any time I draw it, oh, I don't want it. Oh, I don't want it. Oh, no thanks. Oh, no thanks. It's so expensive. It is so underwhelming in terms of its damage output. And because the line is so thin, you have so little control over where people go. Because if you're thunderclapping those cheeks in a line, it's like, okay, as soon as you deviate, right, a little bit, oh, now you're not hitting this guy. It's like, oh, now you're not hitting this guy. Like, it's so hard to get it to work in ways that are meaningful, on top of being a 4 cost and doing very pitiful damage. Yes, it's an AoE stun, but that is the only redeeming quality, and that's the only reason why it's honorable mention. Also, I will say, in my last run, I did pull a modded version that had on redraw gain 1 heroism. So for me and how I think of Thunderclap, that was incredibly useful. If you can ever get a situational niche card that has on redraw gain heroism, that or on redraw gain block, that's the dream. So I did kind of high roll with that one, but in general, Thunderclap, it's so expensive, and I just don't think you need it. You really don't need that line stun. Again, really outside of early game, because early game and new game plus can be quite tricky with like especially wolves. Yeah, Thunderclap just doesn't feel great to me, but I do run 0 or 1 copies. It's not a hard pass for me yet. Maybe one day. Next up, Iron Man. Iron Man is a pretty solid character, but he has a few cards that are pretty useless. First up is, so there's not much to say here. Heads up, it just doesn't scale very well. Frankly, if it did, like if the block coefficient could be higher, or if it, on upgrade it was higher, it would actually be a fairly decent card, right? Like if you wanted to run him more as a supporty character rather than just all in on your Iron Man basket, it would actually be a pretty decent card. And I think that if you were to pull good mods for it, it'd be fun. But the reality is the block is just not there, so it's not a great card. New plan is, yeah, it's not. Oh, yeah, it's a do nothing card almost all the time, because to double your current heroism, for this to be worth it, if you think about like the math and how it works, you would have to have 2 heroism at least in order for this to be even remotely worth it. But for it to be quite worth it, you'd have to run with the likes of like Wolverine, Nico, or Strange, right? For the Midnight Special Crack the Sky enhanced. And if you're running with those characters, you have plenty of other ways of generating heroism anyway. You don't need Iron Man to do it. So not only do you need at least 2 heroism already to make new plan good, but if you have more than 5, yeah, if you have more than 5, you're overclocking it, right? So yeah, new plan just sucks. And then Hellfire Beam isn't inherently a bad card. It does have one neg flaw, and that genuine flaw is you cannot get rid of it if Iron Man gets KO'd, and that sucks. That feels awful. So that's its only true downside. But the problem with Hellfire Beam is more that he has other cards like Air Superiority and Surgical Strike that require, or sorry, that don't take as much effort with the redraws and all that, and they're just more consistent. You can dump them. They're a bit less clunky, right? Whereas Hellfire Beam is very clunky. Furthermore, if you want Hellfire Beam to really pop off, you want to use it quickly, early, but then you also need to use Precision. Transitions to my next point. My honorable mention is Precision. Personally, I know so many people run this card. I see why. I never feel the need to use it at all. Like, thankfully it's free and you can make it cost 0 heroism, but I'm like, the only reason why I would run this card would strictly be to thin my hand. Or like, I have never been like, man, I really wish I had Precision here. It has never benefited me, and when I use Iron Man, I've tried the whole Iron Man carry thing. It's super brain dead, it's super easy, and you really don't need Precision to do it. If you use Hellfire Beam, though, I encourage you to use Precision. I will say that, but personally, I think Precision is just a dead card. It's not a bad card, it's just a dead card to take in the deck, in my opinion. And yes, you can use it, and it's not going to really be to your detriment, but I find it incredibly unnecessary to use in the first place. Next up is Magik. So Magik has like a fair few underwhelming cards, and they all just kind of fall flat, and that's the trend here. So first up, Soul Blast. Fall flat. Like if you've ever played the game, you know what I'm talking about. Soul Blast just feels like, ew, what the hell was that? Like, what was that damage? That was awful. The only way this card sees any real use is with Limbo's Grasp, and even then, by that point, you've already gotten other things like Kick. Unfortunately, Kick's existence really does defeat the purpose of Soul Blast and Trapdoor. So Trapdoor's issue is that it does the exact same damage as Kick on both unupgraded and upgraded, and it does not interact with Limbo's Grasp or Relay, which is a huge problem. Conceptually, Trapdoor is cool, but the reality is it does not pay off. It's not good. Reinforcement is just awful. I feel like I don't really need to explain this one. It's way too RNG. You can't choose who you get. It doesn't give you more card plays or extra hand size, so you're overdrawing, or rather you're not drawing the following turn. This card just sucks. Honorable mention, Gather. This one's a bit of a stretch because I don't think Magik has 4 bad cards. I think she only had 3. But I wanted to mention Gather because Gather is one of the cards that you're cutting eventually from her deck anyway. And so I'm like, well, surely this card's not good enough to be run in her decks, therefore it has to be the honorable mention. But at the very least, it can set your team up for AoEs, line attacks, etc. And early on in the game, if you get a quick Gather Plus, it's quite good. Like, it's quite good early mid-game, but you want to definitely transition away from Gather and just go full Portal Control. Or like, if you want to run Gather until you get Darkchild, basically. And then cut Gather for Darkchild and you're good. Nico... I hate this character, you guys know this, but I did my best. I've played a ton of Nico in the last 2 runs to give her a fair shake, and confidently I will say these are her worst cards. So the first up is Blood for Blood. The simple fact that it's a single target skill that doesn't do a ton of damage, and the healing is RNG, this is just no bueno for me. This does not do it for me. If Nico is missing like 20 health and an ally is missing 90% of their health, and it heals Nico for 20, that is so... bullshit. Like this should read restore 190 health to the lowest health ally. If that was how this read, this would not be on the list, but that is not how it reads, therefore it's on the list. Witchfire, I hate this card. Setting up this card takes way too much effort. It's way too inconsistent. You probably could have just killed the low health units anyway, and the setup does not have a good reward, and you're either praying to RNGesus or you again, put way too much effort in setting this up. It is not worth the deck slot. You should just run Witch's Storm instead, and use Crack the Sky. Because Witch's Storm and Crack the Sky are at least more controllable. Well, Crack the Sky is not controllable, but it at least hits way harder. It hits more targets, and yeah. And Double Up. I think this is probably her worst card. No, it is her worst card. And the irony is the unupgraded Double Up is far better than the upgraded Double Up. Why? Because regular Double Up has Exhaust. And that makes it at least like, okay, the times where you do want to duplicate the attack, the skill, the heroic, whatever you're trying to do, you can set up and pay off that play and just never see it again. And that's actually decent, right? But the upgraded Double Up is awful, because the amount of times where you're like, oh, I'm gonna duplicate this or this, you're probably overcapping your hand. You probably are duplicating things you don't want to duplicate, and the card alone is a do nothing card. It just eats the card play to increase your hand size, which is not what you want, and it's RNG. So like, generate attack, oh I don't want that, redraw. Generate attack, oh I don't want that, redraw. Generate skill, oh I don't want that, oh the mission's over. Right? Like, this card sucks. Even though it should be good, it should be cool, it's not, it sucks. If you're running Double Up and you try cutting it from your deck, look me in the eye and tell me that you missed Double Up. I will not believe you. I will call your ass out and call you a liar. Like, you won't miss Double Up once you cut it from your deck. I promise you. Or at least run an unupgraded version, please. An honorable mention is Swarm. Swarm is just so ho-hum, especially given that 2 of the 3 or 4 damaging options are actually lower than the curve. So if you look at how it's calculated, it's like 75, 100, 125, 150, I believe is the math when I looked at it, of her offense. So 100% offense would be the second one, 75 would be the first one, 125 is the third one, that's the base card, and then the upgraded gives you the 150. It's either that or like the fourth one is 200. I can't remember off the top of my head, I'd have to double check. But the point is, it's a point and click damaging skill, so it does see some use. I run 1 copy in the deck sometimes. By sometimes, I mean it depends on what else I pulled. I do cut it for Witch Storm eventually. But it's okay, I guess, if you high roll. But it's inconsistent. It's another roulette card, so it's on the list. Scarlet Witch, this one took no effort to do, because this character is just dreadful. I until she's not. Like Scarlet Witch goes from being bottom one to being like pretty solid, and it's actually quite funny when you look at the disparity. But in with no question, you cannot debate this. This is a completely closed conversation. She has the worst commons overall in the game. And those three are Hexbolt, Hexfield, Unleashed. They are all dreadful. But let's talk about why briefly. Hexbolt, if you didn't know this, it caps at 5. 5. That is the highest you can take this. And I think that cap either needs to be removed or bumped way up, like 7 or 8. Because not only do you want to run 2 Hexbolts if you're really trying to commit to the Hexbolt style, but the damage per chain is low. It's really low. And the fact it caps at 5, no bueno. Hexfield is a terrible damage AoE, and the AoE around her isn't even that large without Unleashed, but we'll talk about that in a second. The reason why you may run Hexfield is if you get something like Apply 1 Bleed, Apply 1 Weak, Apply 1 Vuln, and these are all mods you can get on Hexfield, and I'll be honest with you, if you roll one of those on Hexfield, it feels pretty good, right? Like it's not bad. But the reality is you don't want those. Or sorry, you don't want Hexfield, you don't want the card, you just want the mod in an AoE of the Hexfield, right? So Hexfield is just an awful card. It feels awful. Unupgraded, it is literally, and I mean this genuinely, I think unupgraded, it is the worst card in the game. And I mean that, and I would rather use Deadly Ground over unupgraded Hexfield, and I'm not joking. I wish I was joking. I'm serious. Unleashed? Okay, I lied. Oh no, Unleashed unupgraded at least gives you 2 heroism. Redeeming factor. Unleashed is by definition a do nothing card, because if you're not running Hexfield, and then you don't really need to use Chaos, like Storm and Chaos Reigns with Unleashed, because they're both decent cards in their own rights with the default size that they are. They don't need to be bigger. Unleashed does not add anything to Scarlet Witch's game plan. Kind of like what I was just saying with double up on Nico. I promise that if you cut Unleashed, and maybe you're like, oh, but Zedd, I use a lot of Detonate, I use No More, I use Chaos Reigns and Chaos Field. Fine. Try cutting Unleashed. I promise you that you're not going to really feel the difference after a few missions. You'll be like, oh yeah, right, Unleashed does this. Like, it's just a... I don't even want to say it's a win harder button. It's more like a QOL card. It's a quality of life card that you really don't need. You really shouldn't be running. Yeah. The Scarlet Witch, these 3 commons are awful. They're probably the 3 worst commons in the game, or at least contenders for. She definitely is a character that requires rares and epics like to really get the ball rolling, and even then, she's quick toss the character. But that's a conversation for another time. Last up, honorable mention, No More. So No More, a lot of people talk about this, how like, oh, why does it kill her? What is this? Why does it kill her? Well, that's the issue, right? It's like it's a decent AoE finisher, so at least it has a function. Like I run a copy of No More for that exact reason, but the reality is the fact that it lowers or it affects your star rating, I think is quite unfair. I think that that's kind of goes against the game's design, right? Like the idea of, oh, I want to try to do the best I can and get 3 out of 3 stars, but then you're designing this character to just actively fight you in that goal, I think is a really BS design. I think that it's unfair. I think that... So that's why it's an honorable mention. Yes, it has a function, but I wanted to address the fact that it does affect your star rating, and I think that's garbage. That's trash. Next up, Spider-Man. I already know that this particular character has been a source of debate, at least in my community, for a long time, and I go back and forth with people all the time, but just hear me out, okay? Spider-Man at one point I thought was the worst character in the game. I do not think that anymore, but he is still quite niche, and or takes a lot of ducks in a row to really get the ball rolling. And these cards sort of exemplify, or encompass is a better word, the issues with the character. Hold up, let me just change. There we go. First up, Chain Strike. It always feels bad to me to draw this card unless for the strict purpose of Nest Mother missions and like bouncing between altars. I hate this card. I will never like this card. It doesn't do enough damage. I hate it. I hate it. It's like Witchfire but controlled. So in that sense, I like it more than Witchfire. that just goes to tell you how bad Witchfire is. Because I hate Chain Strike so much. I only run one copy strictly for those moments where it's like Nest Mother Mission or clean up crew on minions and I don't have any quicks or whatever. Like, it was very useful in my no quicks challenge run, but outside of that, I've always hated this card. I run one because I feel I have to, but if I was ever going to cut a card, it'd be one of the first to go in my Spider-Man decks. Next up, Opportunist. I know you guys are going to be like, shut up and listen. So, Opportunist is not a good card unless it has the Infernal Spider buff. And if you and you open the mission with Opportunist and Infernal Spider. In that specific, and you can somehow generate the heroism to use Infernal Spider at 3 cost. So you see where I'm going with this? Like, there's a lot of things that have to go right for Opportunist to be good. Now let's say it's the second turn, right? I'll give you 1 turn leeway. Let's say it's the second turn and you're like, alright, cool, I got my Infernal Spider on deck, I got my Opportunist on deck. Here's the issue. You use Opportunist and you got your beefed up environmentals. You're like, oh yeah, look at this, look at me go. Well, the issue is it's the point and click versions that do more damage, not the booping versions that do more damage. So things like the drops or the telephone poles or the slides, those are all pretty high value. So number one, Opportunist's power strictly relies on the map itself. I have a big issue with that. Like, so Opportunist thrives in New York just as a region. It kind of blows in Transia. And then for the top of my head, I can't remember what the second one's called, but it's okay there. But in Transia, Opportunist sucks ass. And the card costs a card play. If Opportunist was free, it would be amazing, which is why I said when it has Infernal Spider, I think it's a playable card. And if it had Exhaust, it'd be better. Why? Because once you've used all those interactables, that's it. You're done. And after the first use of Opportunist, anytime you draw it, I guarantee your ass is redrawing it. Like, I guarantee it's gone. And so the fact, it's kind of like Double Up, where if the unupgraded was Exhaust, that would arguably be better, but this is not the case, and neither version of Opportunist has Exhaust. So that's why I hate this card. I cut Opportunist, and I've never looked back. I don't think you need it. I did a no environmental attacks run, and I tell you, they are just icing on the cake. They're just fluff. They're not as good as I thought they were. And I mean that genuinely. They were far less useful than I thought they were. So it was only after that run where I had looked at Opportunist with a better view, and like once I took the crutch, if you will, of environmental attacks away from the gameplay, I was like, why the hell would I run Opportunist? So it's a fun card, yes. It's good if you're running Scarlet Witch, yes. But the reality of the situation is environmental attacks are not strong enough or necessary. This is like the Astral Meditation problem. This card doesn't add enough to your game to require its spot in a deck. Anyway, I feel like I've droned on long enough. I already know you guys are going to disagree with me, but this is coming from someone who, again, used no environmental attacks. I did not miss it, okay? So just try it, I promise. Just try. Like, if you like Opportunist, fine. All the power to you, obviously. It's a game, have fun. But if you're trying to, like, be min-maxy about it, just try it, okay? Like, anyway, next up, Web Throw. For all the time I spent talking about Opportunist, I have very little to say about Web Throw. It, frankly, is just a really expensive and garbage version of Whip, Lash, and Quick Toss. Whip costs you no heroism and has a base damage coefficient for the minor inconvenience of discarding a card. Lash has Quick associated with it and costs you no heroism and has the minor inconvenience of slight damage. Quick Toss is a regular knockback, not forceful, but it's also quick with no downsides at all. So obviously you can't compare like apples to oranges, but the reality is Web Throw cannot exist in the same world where these 3 cards exist, in my opinion. I think that's ridiculous. I think that's egregious. I think whoever designed Web Throw, like, this should be 2 heroism at most. At most, it should be 2 heroism. Definitely 2, maybe 1 if you want to have a conversation, and this number needs to be higher. That's all I have to say on Web Throw. Web Slinger, this is the other hot take. Hear me out. Web Slinger gives strengthened. Web Slinger unupgraded, like Double Up, I like way more than upgraded Web Slinger. Unless you get like some high roll mod on Web Slinger, I don't know. But the reason why is I just don't feel strengthened benefits Spider-Man and his game plan that much, because you have up here, which already has a massive coefficient. Does it help on that card? Of course it does, but you're using up here for the big bursty damage and the weaken. Whip doesn't matter. Spider Sense doesn't matter. Infernal Spider doesn't matter. We're already at 4 cards. And then Quick Kick and Chain Strike, they're semi-situational attack cards anyway, so you'd kind of be sitting on Web Slinger, and that kind of is my point, is the amount of times I was just sitting on Web Slinger like, oh, is this the right turn? Oh, is this a good turn? Oh, is this a good turn? Or redrawing it because it wasn't the good turn. Even though, like, it's so weird. You'd think that a free Strengthened, you'd be like, oh, this is what I want to use. Or I wasn't redrawing it, but I was sitting on it, right? Was just crazy to me. Like, it was shocking how much I was avoiding this card. And then I stood back and I realized, you know what it is? It's because up here is the only significant source of damage this character does. So I was only ever using Web Slinger in conjunction with up here. So I don't personally run it. If you do, that's fine. I don't think it's a wasted deck space, but I just did not feel the need for Web Slinger. I don't really like it. I never found myself using it, so I cut it. And last up is Wolverine. So Wolverine, first up is Quick Swipe. The issue with Quick Swipe is not the card itself so much as I'm looking at it in terms of, well, look at all the other quicks in the game, right? Quick Kick, Quick Slash, Quick Soul Slash, Winds of Watum, Quick Toss, Lash, like the list goes on and on and on. So many have knockback. Well, so that's already a point against this one. You look at Blades. While Blades is ho-hum, at least if the target is bled, it's actually like a pretty significant like source of damage. And you could quick a unit and take one card to do so rather than weakening it with another card and then using the quick, right? So Quick Strike, also not super great, but it does benefit from Blade's design quite a lot. Whereas this one does not. I think Taunt Quick is just such a weird keyword mixture because you only would use Quick when you're killing it. Now, it does give you the flexibility of using it as a point and click taunt, but Wolverine already has so many of those. Stink of Fear, Eviscerate, Chain Swipe, so that argument starts to fall off pretty quickly when you stop and think about it. So Quick Swipe, yes, it does have a high coefficient too, but the fact that it's just a high coefficient quick, it's just not enough for me. Like, it's not enough. I tend to run 0 or 1 copies of this. The only reason I'd run 1 copy is because I don't have 2 copies of Chain Swipe and 2 copies of Lethal Pounce. As soon as I get 2 and 2, Quick Swipe's gone, right? And that's the other issue with this card, is it is contesting a deck space with much, much more useful cards. Again, via Lethal Pounce and Chain Swipe. And that's it. That's your 4 attacks. So there's just no room for Quick Swipe in a Wolverine deck, in my opinion. Now, Rapid Healing, this card is a straight bait. I used to like this card until I stopped using it, and then I never looked back. So this is the effect. If the base effect gave you like 1 resist or lifesteal like Berserk, right, then it would just be awesome. Or if it was like apply bleed or something on the next hit, like just something, right? Something, or gain fast even. I think fast is awful, but I'm just throwing something out there. It needs to do one more thing in order for it to be good, but in its current state, Cure, Restore, it's not good enough. It's not worth the deck slot. The amount of times that I redrew this was just not great. Now you can mod it to do something else. That's the kicker, right? So if you commit to Rapid Healing plus and you get a mod and it's good, like, okay, sure. The issue is he already has his passive to heal him. He has Berserk to heal him. And so there's just, it's a weird card. Like, it's trying to do Berserk's job and his passive's job, but it doesn't do either of them as well as they do. Yeah. Piercing Slash. This has similar issues to a Blade card called Savage, which we talked about earlier. The problem, and the reason why Piercing Slash makes this list as opposed to Savage, is because Piercing Slash has lower damage coefficients than Savage. And I mean, that is partially because Wolverine's offense is lower than Blade's, but the other issue is, that it's competing with a deck slot. And I don't think Piercing Slash just fits into a Wolverine deck Like, it's kind of that simple. Think about it. 2 chain swipe, 2 lethal pounce, right? 2 eviscerate. That we're already at 6, right? Like, we're already at 6, and so now you go 1 berserk and 1 stink of fear. Well, now where do you put midnight special? Oh, well, you're probably going to cut an eviscerate or maybe your second lethal pounce. There's just no room for piercing slash, and on top of it being a relatively weak card, um, Wolverine's deck is honest, and like this is the first character where I'm kind of saying this, and I mean it genuinely. I think he's the first character where the deck is solved, right? Like 2 chains, like 2 lethal pounce, 1 berserk, like 2 chain, 2 lethal pounce, 1 berserk, and then midnight special, stink of fear, and eviscerate. Like, done. Now you can play with, like, you could cut chain swipes to 1 and run 2 eviscerate. You could cut chain swipes to run and run a second stink of fear. Sure, there's like a little flexibility there. I would say 1 chain strike is your flex, but the reality is the reason why you want to run 2 lethal pounce is because the character's damage and tanking abilities are both awful. So you need to commit. Are you committing tank? Well, I don't recommend it. Are you committing damage? I do recommend it. So if you can generate heroism, lethal pounce, midnight special, you're gonna see a lot of success with the character. So yeah, honorable mention, chain swipe. We just talked a lot about it, so I'm gonna rehash a few points. But the reality is, chain swipes is either a point and click taunt, which has its uses, but the best part about the card is the weaken. So when you look at chain swipes and you look at the damage coefficient, you're like, oh, well, that's not a lot of damage, but at least I get to apply a weak. And you can buff it to apply bleed as well. Actually, yeah, I've only gotten apply. Oh, generate more heroism, right? Those are the 2 that I've gotten. So those have been nice. There are other ones, but those are nice. So chain swipes, it's sort of like a necessary evil. You feel like you have to run it, even though you don't want to run it, but you do run it. And so, yeah, that's the issue with chain swipes. But it really does add to his game plan. I've tried cutting it to 1 and 0, and I felt like, or sorry, I've tried cutting it from 1 to 0, and you could tell, right? Like, even though Stink of Fear is a weaken, chain swipes, it really does just sort of piece them together, even though I think it feels kind of rough to play. And this is a character balance issue. I think it's an issue with Wolverine, not so much chain swipe. So that's kind of why it's on the list. Even though it's an integral part of his kit, it still feels bad to use, which sucks, right? And Berserk is the same thing, but yeah, we can talk about that another time. So yeah, there you have it. That's my list. I think I covered everything. If I skipped any of the honorable mentions, I apologize, but I know Charlie, I doubled back to, but that's my thoughts. I've thought a lot about this. I've played the game many, many times and tried all these different cards. I've tried making them work, and I mean, even if I can make them work, they just feel bad. It's like, ooh, I don't want this. Ooh, I don't want that. And whenever I feel that way, I already know it's going to be a contender on the list. And so this list comes down to which cards do I feel that way the most or always? That's the list. So yeah, that's all I got for you. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I will see you in the next one. Let me know your comments down below, and have a good day.